Have you ever noticed how the mind becomes strangely loud at night? The room is quiet, the lights are off, your body is tired enough that it should fall asleep within minutes. Yet the moment your head touches the pillow, your mind begins to move, almost as if it has been waiting all day for this moment. A conversation from earlier suddenly replays in your head. Something you said, something you wish you had said differently. Then your thoughts drift to tomorrow. Things you still need to do. Problems you're not sure how to solve. Possibilities that may never even happen. And before you realize it, you are no longer lying in bed resting. You are traveling through the past and wandering into the future, while the present moment quietly slips away. If this feels familiar, you are not alone. Many people believe the problem is the night itself, that something about nighttime makes the mind restless, but the ancient wisdom of Buddhism offers a very different perspective. The night is not the problem. The problem is the thoughts we continue to feed. The Buddha once observed that the mind behaves very much like a fire. A fire does not burn forever on its own. It burns because something keeps feeding it. Wood, oil, fuel. Our thoughts work in the same way. A single thought may appear in the mind for just a moment, but when we analyze it, replay it, argue with it, or worry about it, we unknowingly add more fuel to the flame, and slowly, quietly, the fire grows. This is why the mind can become so active at night. Not because the mind is broken, but because the world finally becomes quiet enough for us to notice what we have been feeding all day. But here is the beautiful part. If a fire grows when it is fed, it also fades when the fuel is no longer added. In this video, we will explore a gentle piece of Buddhist wisdom that can completely change the way you experience your nights. A simple shift in understanding that may help you stop feeding the thoughts that keep you awake. And when that happens, something surprising begins to appear in the silence. Not struggle, not effort, but a quiet kind of peace that was there all along, waiting for the mind to finally rest. 1. Why the mind becomes loud at night. But there is something about the night that many people quietly notice, yet rarely understand. During the day, the mind seems manageable. You move from one task to another. Messages arrive, conversations happen. The noise of the world keeps your attention busy, almost like waves constantly moving across the surface of the ocean. Yet, the moment night arrives, everything changes. The room becomes quiet. The phone is set aside. The responsibilities of the day slowly fade into the background. And strangely, this is when the mind begins to speak the loudest. You may lie in bed feeling physically exhausted, ready to sleep. But suddenly, thoughts begin appearing, one after another, almost like a long line of visitors who have been waiting patiently outside the door all day. A moment from the afternoon reappears. A mistake from years ago quietly returns. An unfinished task from tomorrow begins to whisper in the back of your mind. And soon, the silence of the night is filled with the movement of thoughts. Many people believe this means something is wrong with them. They assume their mind is too restless, too anxious, or too broken to rest. But what if something much simpler is happening? During the day, your mind is constantly distracted. There are meetings to attend, notifications appearing on screens, traffic, conversations, deadlines, responsibilities. The mind jumps from one thing to another so quickly that it barely has time to finish a single thought. Imagine a busy marketplace at noon. People talking, footsteps everywhere, music playing from distant shops. In that environment, even if someone whispers your name from across the street, you might never hear it. But at midnight, when the market is empty and silent, even the smallest sound becomes noticeable. The mind works in a very similar way. Throughout the day, countless thoughts pass quietly through your awareness, but because your attention is occupied, you hardly notice them. Night simply removes the noise, and in that silence, the thoughts that were always there suddenly become clear. But there is another reason the mind becomes active at night, something deeply human. The mind likes closure. Psychologists often talk about the brain's tendency to complete unfinished loops. When something remains unresolved, a conversation that ended awkwardly, a decision that hasn't been made, a worry that hasn't been answered, the mind keeps returning to it, almost as if it is trying to finish a sentence that was never completed. Have you ever noticed how a single unfinished thought can return again and again? You might be lying in bed when suddenly you remember something small, a message you forgot to send, a conversation you wish had gone differently, and the mind begins to replay the moment. At first, just once, then again, each time adding more details, more imagined outcomes, more emotional weight. It is not trying to torture you. In its own strange way, the mind is trying to solve something, but the night is not always the best place to find solutions. Instead, the mind often becomes trapped in circles, moving between regret about the past and worry about the future. You might replay something that happened 5 years ago, and then jump forward to something that might happen tomorrow. Back and forth, past and future, regret and anticipation. Meanwhile, the present moment, the quiet room, the soft rhythm of your breathing, the simple comfort of lying in bed goes almost unnoticed. This is why nighttime thinking can feel so overwhelming. Not because the mind is stronger at night, but because the silence allows us to finally hear it. And if you think about it carefully, something interesting begins to appear. The thoughts themselves are not necessarily the problem. A thought can arise naturally, just like a cloud appearing in the sky. But what often happens next is something we rarely notice. The mind begins to follow the thought, then analyze it, then argue with it, then imagine 10 different outcomes. And slowly, almost without realizing it, a single small thought turns into a long chain of mental activity that keeps the mind awake. It is a bit like sitting beside a small spark of fire. If you leave it alone, it may fade on its own. But if you keep adding small pieces of wood, the flame grows stronger. So the real question becomes this: what if the reason the mind stays so active at night is not because thoughts appear, but because we continue feeding them? And once a person begins to see this clearly, something very gentle but very powerful starts to change. Because the moment you realize you are feeding the fire, you also realize that you can stop adding wood. 2. The habit of feeding thoughts. But here is something subtle that most people never notice. The problem is not that thoughts appear in the mind. Thoughts appearing is natural. It is simply what the mind does. The deeper issue is something much quieter, something we rarely see while it is happening. We feed them. In the previous part, we talked about how the mind becomes louder when the world grows quiet. When the distractions of the day fade, thoughts that were always present begin to surface. But what often keeps those thoughts alive is not their presence. It is our attention. A single thought can appear for only a moment, just like a bird briefly landing on a tree branch. But when we start analyzing it, questioning it, replaying it, or imagining different outcomes, something interesting happens. The mind begins to build a whole story around that one small thought. And before long, that small bird is no longer alone. It has become an entire flock. Think about a very ordinary moment many people experience at night. You are lying in bed, the room dim and quiet. Your body is still. The day has ended. And suddenly, a memory appears. Maybe it is something simple, something someone said earlier in the day. At first, it is just a small recollection. But then the mind begins asking questions. Why did they say that? Did they mean something else? Should I have responded differently? Maybe you imagine a different version of the conversation, then another version. Then you begin wondering what that person might be thinking about you now. And slowly, that one tiny memory turns into a long chain of imagined conversations and emotional reactions. But if you look carefully, something becomes clear. The original thought was very small. What made it grow was the attention you gave it. In Buddhist teachings, the mind is often compared to something that grows through attachment. Not attachment in the sense of love, but attachment in the sense of holding on, examining, and feeding mental patterns. The more attention a thought receives, the more space it begins to occupy. It is very similar to a vine growing along a wall. At first, it is only a thin green stem, barely noticeable. But if it continues receiving sunlight and space to grow, it slowly spreads across the entire surface. Soon the wall is completely covered. Our thoughts behave in a surprisingly similar way. They reach toward our attention like vines reaching toward light. And attention is powerful. Whatever the mind focuses on becomes stronger in experience. A worry becomes heavier. A memory becomes more emotional. An imagined future becomes more vivid than reality itself. Have you ever noticed how easily the mind can turn a very small concern into something that feels enormous? A person might remember a mistake from years ago, something most people have already forgotten. Yet, when the mind keeps replaying the scene, analyzing every detail, imagining what others might have thought, the moment begins to feel larger than it really was. This does not happen because the event itself was huge. It happens because the mind keeps feeding it. There's a quiet story many people recognize. Someone sits alone late at night, staring at the ceiling. The house is silent. Everyone else is asleep. The mind begins revisiting moments from the past, old conversations, old regrets, old questions. Each thought seems to invite another one. And without realizing it, the mind is building a long narrative out of fragments of memory and imagination. But here is the gentle insight that Buddhist wisdom often points toward. Thoughts themselves are not enemies. They are simply mental events passing through awareness. The suffering begins when we treat every thought as something important, something that must be solved, analyzed, or understood immediately. It is a bit like sitting beside a river. If leaves float by on the surface, you could simply watch them pass. But if you jump into the water to grab every leaf, the river suddenly becomes exhausting. Many people live this way with their thoughts. Every idea must be followed. Every worry must be examined. Every memory must be explained. And so the mind never truly rests. But imagine something different for a moment. Imagine the same quiet night, the same room, the same bed, the same soft darkness. A thought appears, perhaps a memory, perhaps a worry. But instead of reaching toward it, analyzing it, or adding more story to it, you simply notice it. You allow it to be there for a moment, and then you allow it to pass, like a cloud moving slowly across the night sky. What would happen if thoughts no longer received constant fuel? What would happen if attention became softer, more spacious, less attached? Little by little, something interesting begins to change. The vines stop spreading, the stories stop growing, and the mind, which once felt crowded with noise, begins to rediscover something it had almost forgotten: space. 3. The nighttime loop of regret and worry. But there is a quiet pattern that begins to reveal itself when we watch the mind carefully at night. Most thoughts that keep people awake belong to just two places: the past and the future, almost never the present. In the previous section, we explored how thoughts grow when they receive attention. A small memory becomes a story, and a simple concern becomes a long chain of imagined outcomes. But when people lie awake at night, the mind rarely wanders randomly. It usually moves between two familiar territories: regret and worry. Regret looks backward, worry looks forward, and the mind moves between them like a pendulum swinging back and forth. Many people know this experience very well. You lie down, hoping to rest, but suddenly a moment from the past appears. Maybe it was something you said during a conversation. Maybe it was a decision you made years ago. Maybe it was an opportunity you didn't take. The mind begins replaying the scene. It examines the words again. It imagines how things could have gone differently. It wonders what other people might have thought. And slowly, regret begins to form. Why did I say that? I should have done something different. If only I had known then what I know now. These thoughts often arrive quietly, but they carry a surprising emotional weight. A small moment from 10 years ago can suddenly feel very present again. And just as the mind becomes tired of looking backward, something else begins to appear: the future. Now the mind begins imagining what might happen tomorrow, next week, or years from now. A conversation you are worried about, a responsibility that feels overwhelming, a situation that has not yet happened, but somehow already feels stressful. What if this goes wrong? What if I fail? What if things don't work out the way I hope? And just like that, the mind jumps from the past to the future, from regret to worry, from what already happened to what might happen. And in this constant movement, something very important disappears: the present moment, the quiet room, the steady rhythm of your breathing, the gentle stillness of the night. These things are always there, yet the mind is too busy traveling through time to notice them. Buddhist teachings often describe this habit of the mind very simply. Suffering grows when the mind leaves the present and becomes trapped in memories or projections, not because the past and the future are meaningless, but because when the mind clings to them, it creates stories that never truly resolve. A memory cannot be changed. An imagined future cannot be controlled. Yet the mind continues revisiting both. There's a simple scene many people recognize. Someone lies awake in bed, staring quietly at the ceiling. The house is completely still. Outside, the world is asleep. But inside the mind, entire conversations are happening. Arguments are replayed. Plans are rehearsed. Regrets are revisited. And worries are constructed from possibilities that may never even occur. From the outside, the person appears perfectly still. But inside, the mind is running marathons through time. Have you ever noticed how exhausting that can be? The body wants to rest, but the mind refuses to arrive. It keeps traveling. Backward, forward, backward again, forward again. Almost as if it believes that somewhere in that movement, it will finally find peace. But here is the quiet truth that many people eventually discover. Peace is not waiting in the past, and it is not hiding in the future either. Peace exists only where the mind rarely stays long enough to see it. Right here, in this moment. But the mind often misses this because it believes regret will fix the past and worry will protect the future, so it keeps moving. And as long as the mind continues feeding these two directions, regret and worry, the night becomes restless, sleep feels distant, and the quiet of the room becomes filled with invisible noise. But once a person begins to recognize this loop, something important begins to change. They start to see the pattern. They begin to notice when the mind travels backward. They begin to notice when it jumps forward again. And that awareness creates the first small opening. Because when you see the loop clearly, you also begin to realize something unexpected. You do not have to keep following it. 4. What Buddha noticed about the mind. But there is a quiet realization that begins to change everything once a person truly sees it. The thoughts in your mind are not actually you. In the previous part, we saw how the mind can move endlessly between regret about the past and worry about the future, almost like a traveler who never stops walking, believing peace is somewhere farther down the road. Yet, the more the mind travels, the more tired it becomes. And at night, when the world grows silent, that restless movement becomes impossible to ignore. Many centuries ago, the Buddha spent long periods simply observing the mind, not trying to control it, not trying to silence it by force, but watching it carefully with patience and curiosity. And what he discovered was something both simple and deeply liberating. Thoughts appear, and then they disappear, just like clouds drifting across the sky. But human beings often make a small mistake that leads to great suffering. We assume that every thought belongs to us. We believe every thought tells the truth. And we treat every thought as something important that must be followed. Yet, if you watch your mind carefully, something interesting becomes visible. Thoughts arise on their own. A memory appears, an idea appears, a worry appears. But you did not sit down and consciously decide to create those thoughts. They simply emerged, the same way a breeze moves through an open window. And if that is true, then an important question appears. If you did not choose the thought that appeared, why must you believe it? Why must you follow it? This was one of the gentle insights the Buddha discovered while observing the nature of the mind. Thoughts are events, not identity. They are movements in consciousness, not the definition of who you are. But because most people never look closely at this process, they begin to fuse themselves with their thoughts. A worried thought appears, and suddenly they feel like a worried person. A regretful thought appears, and suddenly they feel like someone defined by past mistakes. But what if those thoughts are simply passing weather in the sky of the mind? Imagine sitting quietly outside on a calm evening. Above you, clouds drift slowly across the sky. Some clouds are light and soft. Some clouds are dark and heavy. Yet, no matter how large or dramatic they appear, one thing remains true. The sky itself is never harmed by the clouds. The sky does not become the storm. The storm simply passes through it. The Buddha often used this kind of quiet observation to understand the human mind. He noticed that suffering rarely comes from the appearance of a thought. Suffering begins when we cling to the thought, when we believe it, when we build an identity around it. Imagine again the person lying awake in bed at night, the same quiet room we have been returning to. A thought appears. Maybe I'm not good enough. At first, it is only a sentence passing through the mind. But if that thought is believed, the mind begins building a story around it. Memories appear to support it. Past mistakes resurface. Imagined failures begin forming in the future. Soon, what was once a simple thought begins to feel like a personal truth. But the Buddha noticed something very different. A thought is only a visitor. It knocks on the door of the mind, stays for a moment, and then leaves, unless we invite it inside and ask it to stay. Have you ever noticed how quickly a thought disappears when you simply observe it without holding on? It arises, pauses briefly, and fades away, almost like a ripple in water returning to stillness. There is a quiet story often told in meditation circles. A man once asked a teacher why his mind felt so heavy with thoughts. The teacher handed him a glass of water and dropped a small handful of salt into it. "Drink," the teacher said. The man took a sip and immediately made a face. The water was unbearably salty. Then the teacher took the same amount of salt and threw it into a large lake. "Now taste the water," the teacher said again. The man scooped some water from the lake and drank. It tasted completely normal. "The salt is the same," the teacher explained. "The difference is the size of the container." In the same way, when the mind is small and tightly attached to its thoughts, even a small worry can feel overwhelming. But when the mind becomes spacious, when it learns to observe thoughts rather than cling to them, the same thoughts lose their power. They pass through. And slowly, something remarkable begins to happen. The mind starts to feel lighter, not because thoughts have completely disappeared, but because you are no longer holding them so tightly. And in that quiet space between thoughts, something very gentle begins to reveal itself. A stillness that was always there, waiting beneath the noise. 5. Thoughts are like seeds. But there is another quiet way to understand the mind, one that makes the whole process suddenly clearer. Thoughts behave very much like seeds. In the previous part, we explored something the Buddha noticed about the nature of the mind, that thoughts come and go like clouds, and suffering often begins when we cling to them. When we believe every thought, follow every thought, and build stories around them. But if we look even deeper, we begin to notice something else. Not every thought grows. Some appear for a moment and disappear. Others slowly expand until they fill the entire mind. Why does that happen? The answer is surprisingly simple. Attention is like water, and thoughts are like seeds. A seed on dry ground does very little. It simply rests there, small and quiet. But when water reaches it, when the conditions are right, that tiny seed begins to grow roots, stretch upward, and eventually become something much larger. The same thing happens inside the mind. Every thought that appears is like a small seed landing in the soil of awareness. Some seeds carry joy, some carry creativity, some carry peace, but many others carry worry, regret, doubt, or fear. And without realizing it, we begin watering them with our attention. Think again of the quiet scene we have been returning to throughout this video. The still bedroom at night. The lights are off. The room is calm. The world outside has slowed down. A single thought appears. What if something goes wrong tomorrow? At first, it is just a tiny seed, a brief moment of concern that could easily pass, but the mind begins to focus on it. What if the meeting goes badly? What if people judge me? What if I fail? Each question is like another drop of water, and the seed begins to grow. Soon the mind imagines entire scenarios, conversations that have not happened, problems that may never exist, outcomes that are purely imagined. And suddenly, what started as a single thought becomes an entire emotional landscape. The body becomes tense. Sleep feels distant. and the mind continues watering the very thing that is disturbing its peace. Have you ever noticed how easily this happens? A small worry becomes a long chain of worries. A brief doubt becomes a story about who you are. A simple memory becomes a painful regret. Yet, the original seed was tiny. It grew only because it was nourished. There is a quiet truth in Buddhist wisdom that many people eventually discover. The mind does not suffer from the presence of seeds. It suffers from the seeds it repeatedly waters. Imagine two small seeds placed in the same garden. One is a seed of fear, the other is a seed of calm awareness. If every day the gardener waters only the seed of fear, that plant will grow stronger and stronger. Its roots will spread deep into the soil, and its branches will begin to cover the entire garden. But if the gardener begins watering the seed of calm instead, giving attention to breathing, presence, and simple awareness, something else begins to grow. The garden slowly changes. The same garden, the same soil, but different plants. This is why awareness is so powerful. It quietly determines which parts of the mind become strong. There is a gentle image sometimes shared in meditation teachings. A person sits beside a quiet pond at sunset. Leaves occasionally fall onto the surface of the water. If the person picks up every leaf and holds on to it, soon their hands are full, and the pond becomes chaotic. But if the leaves are simply allowed to float, they eventually drift away on their own. Thoughts behave in the same way. The moment we grab them, analyze them, and hold on to them, they remain in the mind much longer. But when they are allowed to simply pass, they lose their strength. And perhaps the most interesting part of this process appears at night. Because nighttime is when many people unknowingly water the seeds of worry the most. The body is tired, the world is quiet, and the mind finally has the space to focus inward. But instead of resting in that quiet, it begins revisiting problems, imagining future scenarios, replaying past mistakes. Drop by drop, attention feeds the seeds of anxiety. Yet once a person sees this clearly, something very gentle becomes possible. You begin to notice which seeds you are watering. You notice when attention moves toward fear. You notice when the mind starts building stories around a single thought. And in that moment of awareness, a quiet choice appears. You can stop watering that seed. You can allow it to remain small, because not every thought deserves to grow. And when fewer seeds are watered, the garden of the mind slowly begins to change. More space appears, more stillness returns, and the night, which once felt crowded with worries, begins to feel softer, quieter, and far more peaceful. 6. The illusion that thinking solves everything. But there is another quiet belief hiding behind many restless nights. And most people never question it. The belief that if we think long enough, we will finally solve everything. After all, this is what the mind tells us. If we keep analyzing the situation, if we keep replaying the problem, if we keep imagining every possible outcome, then somehow we will be more prepared. It feels responsible. It feels intelligent. It even feels necessary. But is it really helping? Earlier, we talked about how thoughts can grow like seeds when they receive attention. A single worry appears, and with enough focus, it slowly becomes a full story that fills the mind. But the reason we keep feeding those thoughts is often because we believe they are useful. The mind quietly whispers something very convincing. If I keep thinking about this, I'll figure it out. And so we continue. The mind replays conversations. It imagines what others might say. It predicts possible problems. It creates backup plans for situations that may never even happen. On the surface, It feels like preparation. But beneath that activity, something else is happening. Tension begins to grow. The body becomes restless. Sleep slowly moves farther away. And instead of clarity, the mind becomes more crowded. Many people know this experience well. A person lies in bed late at night, staring at the ceiling. The room is silent, yet their mind is busy working through problems from the day. Maybe it is a conversation that didn't go well at work. Maybe it is a decision they must make tomorrow. Maybe it is a fear about the future. The mind begins searching for the perfect answer. If I say this, maybe they will respond that way. But what if that goes wrong? Maybe I should try something different? And so the mind continues building scenario after scenario. But hours pass, and nothing is truly resolved. Instead of peace, there is only more thinking. This is the illusion many people fall into. The belief that thinking more will eventually bring control. Yet Buddhist wisdom gently points out something different. Thinking is a tool, but it is not meant to run endlessly. Just as a knife can be useful in the kitchen, but dangerous when held too tightly, the mind's ability to think is powerful, but only when used at the right moment. There is a quiet difference between useful thinking and repetitive thinking. Useful thinking happens when the mind calmly considers a situation and arrives at a practical step. It moves forward. Repetitive thinking, however, circles the same ground again and again without arriving anywhere new. It is like walking in circles inside a room while believing you are traveling somewhere important. Imagine someone trying to solve a problem while sitting at a desk during the day. The mind is clear, the body is alert, and decisions can be made. But imagine trying to solve the same problem at 2 in the morning, when the body is exhausted and the mind is already overwhelmed. The same problem begins to feel much larger than it truly is. What was once a small issue suddenly feels like a crisis. This is why many people wake up in the morning and realize that the problem they worried about all night suddenly feels smaller. Nothing actually changed. Only the mind became rested. There is a simple scene that illustrates this beautifully. A man once carried a heavy backpack filled with stones during a long walk through the mountains. At first, he believed every stone was necessary, so he continued carrying them. But as the hours passed, the weight became exhausting. Eventually, he sat down beside the trail and began removing the stones one by one. With every stone he set down, the walk became lighter. And then he realized something surprising. Most of the stones had never been necessary in the first place. Our thoughts can work the same way. The mind collects possibilities, worries, and imagined outcomes as if each one must be carried. But many of those thoughts are not helping us move forward. They are simply weight. Have you ever noticed that the mind rarely knows when to stop? If it believes thinking equals control, it will continue thinking long after the thinking has stopped being useful. And this is where awareness becomes important. Not to eliminate thinking, but to recognize when thinking has become a loop. When the same thought repeats itself without offering a new insight. When the mind is no longer solving a problem, but simply circling it. In that moment, a quiet realization begins to appear. The mind does not always need another thought. Sometimes, what it truly needs is rest. And when a person finally recognizes the moment when thinking is no longer helping, they discover something surprisingly powerful. They can stop. They can gently step out of the circle. And in that small act of letting go, the mind begins to rediscover something it has been searching for all along: stillness. 7. The gentle practice of not following a thought. But here is the quiet shift that begins to change everything. What if you didn't have to follow every thought that appears? Up until now, we have explored how the mind feeds thoughts, how regret and worry create endless loops, and how the illusion of constant thinking convinces us that more thoughts will somehow solve our problems. Yet, something surprising begins to happen the moment we see this pattern clearly. We realize that the mind is constantly offering thoughts, but we are not required to follow them. This may sound simple, but for many people, it feels almost impossible at first. Because most of us have spent our entire lives believing that every thought deserves our attention. A thought appears, and we immediately chase it. We examine it, we respond to it, we argue with it, we try to fix it. But Buddhist wisdom offers a very different approach. Instead of controlling thoughts, we can learn to observe them, not with resistance, not with judgment, but with quiet awareness. Imagine again the same peaceful night scene we have returned to throughout this video. The room is dark and quiet. You are lying comfortably in bed, your breathing slow and steady. And suddenly, a thought appears. Perhaps it is a memory. Perhaps it is a worry about tomorrow. In the past, the mind would immediately follow it, like stepping onto a train that begins traveling far away from the present moment. But this time, something different happens. Instead of climbing onto the train, you remain standing on the platform. You simply watch the thought appear. You notice it, and then you allow it to move on. The thought may linger for a moment, just like a cloud drifting slowly across the night sky. But if you do not chase it, it eventually continues moving. This is one of the simplest and most powerful practices in mindfulness. Not fighting thoughts, not forcing them to disappear, just allowing them to pass. Many people misunderstand meditation or mindfulness as an attempt to stop thinking completely. But the mind was never designed to become permanently silent. Thoughts will continue to appear, just as waves continue to rise and fall on the surface of the ocean. The goal is not to stop the waves. The goal is to stop drowning in them. Imagine standing beside a river. Leaves float by on the surface of the water. Some leaves are bright and beautiful. Others are dark or broken. But if you remain standing on the riverbank, simply watching them pass, the river continues flowing peacefully. Yet, if you jump into the water and try to grab every leaf that floats by, the current quickly becomes overwhelming. The same thing happens with thoughts. Every thought invites your attention, but you do not have to grab it. You do not have to chase it. You do not have to build a story around it. You can simply notice it and let it move on. There is a quiet moment many people experience when they first practice this. They are lying in bed, noticing their breathing. A thought appears. For a moment, the old habit begins. The mind tries to follow it, but suddenly they remember. They pause, they observe the thought instead, and something surprising happens. The thought loses its momentum. It fades more quickly than expected, and for a brief moment, the mind becomes quiet again. This is the difference between control and letting go. Control tries to force the mind into silence. Letting go simply stops feeding the noise. One approach creates tension. The other creates space. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to fight your own thoughts? The more we try to suppress them, the stronger they often return. But when we stop resisting them and simply allow them to pass, something softens inside the mind. The struggle disappears. There is a gentle story that illustrates this idea beautifully. A young student once told a meditation teacher that his mind was too full of thoughts. I try to push them away, he said, but they just come back stronger. The teacher smiled and replied, imagine sitting beside a busy road. Cars are constantly passing by. If you try to stop every car with your hands, you will quickly become exhausted. But if you simply sit beside the road and watch them pass, eventually the traffic no longer disturbs you. Thoughts are very similar. They will continue to pass through the mind, but when you stop chasing them, they lose their power to carry you away. And slowly, the mind begins to rediscover something it had forgotten. Stillness between the thoughts. Not forced, not controlled, simply allowed. And in that growing stillness, the night begins to feel different. Not like a battlefield of restless thinking, but like a quiet sky where thoughts drift gently by. 8. Returning to the breath and the body. And this is the moment when something very simple, yet very powerful, begins to help. When the mind stops chasing thoughts, a quiet question naturally appears. Where should the mind rest instead? In the previous part, we explored the gentle practice of not following every thought, learning to watch thoughts like clouds passing through the sky, without grabbing them or trying to push them away. But many people notice something interesting when they first try this. When they stop following thoughts, the mind immediately begins searching for something else to hold on to. It is almost like a restless traveler who suddenly stops walking and asks, "Now where do I go?" This is where one of the most ancient and calming practices in Buddhist wisdom appears. Returning to the breath, not forcing it, not controlling it, simply noticing it. Your breath is always there, quietly moving in and out of the body from the moment you are born until the moment life ends. Yet, during most of the day, we barely notice it. The mind is too busy thinking about the past or planning the future to pay attention to something so simple. But at night, when the room becomes quiet and the body begins to slow down, the breath becomes something very special. It becomes an anchor. Imagine a boat floating gently on the surface of the ocean. If the boat has no anchor, it drifts wherever the waves and currents carry it. In the same way, when the mind has nothing to rest on, it drifts from thought to thought, from memory to worry, endlessly moving. But when the anchor drops into the water, the boat becomes steady. The waves may still move, but the boat no longer drifts far away. The breath works in the same way for the mind. When you gently bring attention to your breathing, the mind begins to settle, not because thoughts disappear immediately, but because awareness has found somewhere peaceful to rest. Imagine again that familiar scene. You are lying in bed. The room is dark, quiet, and calm. Thoughts may still appear here and there like distant echoes of the day. But instead of following them, you gently notice your breathing. You feel the air entering through your nose. You feel the chest rising slowly. You feel the body sinking deeper into the softness of the bed as you exhale. Nothing complicated, nothing forced, just breathing. And with every breath, something subtle begins to happen. The mind moves closer to the present moment. The past becomes quieter. The future becomes less urgent, because the breath only exists now. There is also something else that helps the mind relax even more, returning not only to the breath, but to the body itself. During the day, we spend most of our time living inside our thoughts. The body moves automatically while the mind is somewhere else, thinking about emails, conversations, deadlines, expectations. But when we gently bring attention back to the body, the mind begins to slow down. You may begin noticing the simple feeling of your head resting on the pillow, the warmth of the blanket covering your body, the weight of your arms resting beside you, the soft rise and fall of your chest. These small sensations are always present, yet we rarely notice them. And when attention returns to them, something deeply calming begins to unfold. You might slowly allow the body to soften. The muscles in the face relax. The shoulders release the tension they carried all day. The jaw loosens. The legs sink deeper into the bed. It is almost as if the body has been waiting all day for permission to rest. Have you ever noticed how much tension the body quietly carries without us realizing it? Sometimes people lie awake at night, not because the mind is loud, but because the body is still holding the weight of the entire day. But when attention gently moves through the body breath by breath, sensation by sensation, the tension begins to melt. There is a quiet moment many people experience during this practice. At first, the mind still wanders. A thought appears, then another. But each time, attention returns to the breath, to the feeling of the body resting. The thoughts lose their urgency. They begin to fade into the background. It is like sitting beside a peaceful lake at dusk. Ripples may appear on the surface of the water for a while, but as the wind settles, the lake slowly becomes still again. The mind works in a similar way. Stillness does not come from forcing silence. It comes from gently returning to the present moment again and again. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this practice is how ordinary it is. You do not need special skills. You do not need to change anything about the night. All that is required is a simple shift of attention, from thoughts back to breath, from imagination back to the body, from the noise of the mind back to the quiet rhythm of life moving through you. And when that shift happens, even for a few moments, something very peaceful begins to appear. The night no longer feels like a place where the mind struggles with itself. Instead, it becomes a space where the body rests, the breath flows gently, and the mind slowly remembers how to be still. 9. Letting the day end without carrying it. But there is one quiet habit that keeps many minds awake at night, even after the body is exhausted. We try to carry the entire day into tomorrow. After learning to observe thoughts and gently return to the breath, many people begin to notice something surprising. The mind still holds on to unfinished moments from the day, almost as if it refuses to let the day end. It replays conversations. It revisits decisions. It tries to solve problems that appeared hours ago. And somewhere deep inside, the mind whispers a familiar belief. I can't rest yet. There are still things to figure out. This is a feeling many people recognize. You lie in bed, ready to sleep, but the mind quietly begins reviewing the entire day. A meeting that didn't go as planned, a message you wish you had answered differently, a responsibility waiting for you tomorrow. The mind begins organizing, analyzing, correcting, almost like a person cleaning a room late at night, determined to fix everything before turning off the lights. At first, this seems reasonable. After all, we want our lives to be in order. We want things to be complete. We want clarity. But there is something the mind often forgets. A day does not need to be perfect in order to end, and life rarely offers complete closure before night arrives. Yet many people have quietly developed the habit of refusing to let the day finish unless everything feels resolved. But if you look closely, this expectation creates a hidden kind of exhaustion. Because most days contain unfinished conversations, unanswered questions, problems that cannot be solved in a single evening. And when the mind refuses to accept this, it continues working long after the body needs rest. Buddhist wisdom often reminds us of something simple. but deeply important. Everything in life moves in cycles. Day becomes night. Activity becomes rest. Breath enters and breath leaves. But when the mind resists the natural rhythm of ending and resting, tension quietly builds. Imagine someone carrying a heavy bag throughout the day. Inside the bag are small items collected along the way: memories, worries, unfinished tasks, moments of frustration. At night, instead of placing the bag down beside the bed, the person keeps holding it, even while trying to sleep. It is no surprise that rest becomes difficult. There is a quiet story that reflects this truth. A traveler once walked a long road carrying a heavy basket of stones. When night came, he sat down beside the road but continued holding the basket tightly in his arms. An old monk passing by asked him gently, "Why are you still holding that?" The traveler replied, "Because these stones are important." The monk smiled and said, "Then place them beside you and carry them again in the morning." The traveler hesitated, but eventually set the basket down. For the first time that day, his arms relaxed, and in that moment, he realized something he had not noticed before. The stones had only felt unbearable because he refused to put them down. Our thoughts can work the same way. The mind collects the events of the day and holds on to them as if they must all be carried into the night. But the truth is, many things do not need to be solved before sleep. Some answers arrive tomorrow, some problems become clearer after rest, and some worries quietly disappear when the mind stops holding them so tightly. Have you ever noticed how a problem that feels overwhelming at night sometimes feels manageable the next morning? Nothing about the situation actually changed. Only the mind became rested. Clarity often appears after the mind has been allowed to rest, not when it has been forced to keep working. This is why learning to let the day end is such a powerful practice. Not by ignoring responsibilities, not by pretending problems do not exist, but by accepting that the mind deserves rest just as much as the body does. When night arrives, it can be helpful to quietly acknowledge the day that has passed, the conversations, the mistakes, the efforts, the unfinished tasks, and then gently allow them to remain where they belong in the day that has already ended. Tomorrow will bring its own energy, its own clarity, its own perspective. But the night is not meant for carrying everything forward. It is meant for letting go, for allowing the mind to soften, for giving the body permission to rest. And when a person finally allows the day to close without demanding perfection, something subtle begins to shift. The mind stops gripping the past. The weight of unfinished moments begins to loosen, and the night slowly becomes what it was always meant to be: a quiet space where nothing more needs to be solved, and everything can finally be set down. 10. The quiet power of acceptance. But there is one final shift that often brings the deepest sense of peace to the mind at night. And strangely, it is not something we add. It is something we stop doing. For much of our lives, the mind believes it must solve everything immediately. Every question must have an answer. Every problem must be fixed. Every uncomfortable feeling must be resolved before we can finally relax. But when night arrives, reality quietly shows us something different. Not everything in life can be solved today. Some questions remain open. Some situations need time. Some answers appear only after the mind has rested. Yet many people lie awake at night because they are still resisting this truth. The mind keeps pushing. It tries to force solutions. It argues with the past. It negotiates with the future. But this constant resistance only creates more tension. And this is where acceptance begins to reveal its quiet power. Acceptance does not mean giving up. It does not mean ignoring responsibilities or pretending that problems do not exist. Acceptance simply means allowing this moment to be what it is, without demanding that it become something else immediately. Imagine again the familiar night we have been returning to throughout this journey. You are lying in bed. The room is calm and silent. A thought appears, perhaps, about something unfinished in your life. In the past, the mind might have immediately resisted it. I shouldn't feel this way. I need to fix this. I have to figure this out tonight. But now something different happens. Instead of fighting the thought, you simply acknowledge it. Yes, this is here. And then you allow it to be. Strangely, when resistance disappears, the mind begins to soften. Because resistance often feeds the very tension we are trying to escape. Have you ever noticed how a problem sometimes feels heavier when we keep pushing against it? But when we pause and allow things to be as they are, the pressure slowly fades. Buddhist teachings often speak about this gentle relationship with reality. Suffering grows when we fight what already exists. Peace begins when we allow things to be present without struggle. There is a quiet story that reflects this beautifully. A man once tried to smooth the surface of a lake by pushing down every ripple with his hands. The harder he tried, the more disturbed the water became. But when he finally stopped touching the water, the lake slowly returned to stillness on its own. The mind behaves in the same way. When we constantly try to control every thought and every feeling, the inner surface of the mind becomes more restless. But when we allow things to settle naturally, calm begins to return. This is why acceptance can feel so deeply calming at night, because the mind no longer needs to keep working. It no longer needs to solve everything before resting. Instead, it can gently acknowledge the truth of the moment. Today may not have been perfect. Some things remain unfinished. Some questions remain unanswered. And that is okay. Life continues unfolding tomorrow. Have you ever noticed how comforting it feels when someone simply says, "You don't have to figure everything out right now"? In many ways, acceptance is the mind learning to offer that same kindness to itself. And when that kindness appears, something inside the mind finally relaxes. The struggle softens, the grip loosens, and the night becomes quieter. Not because every problem disappeared, but because the mind stopped fighting reality. And when resistance fades, something else begins to emerge. A deeper calm. The kind of calm that does not come from controlling life, but from allowing life to breathe. 11. When the mind finally slows down. And eventually, something very subtle begins to happen. The mind starts to slow down. Not because it was forced to become quiet, but because it no longer has anything left to chase. Earlier in this journey, the mind was busy feeding thoughts, replaying memories, worrying about the future, trying to solve every unfinished piece of the day. But now, little by little, those movements begin to lose their urgency. Thoughts still appear, but they come less frequently. And when they do appear, they pass more gently. It is like watching the sky after a long storm. At first, the clouds move quickly, thick and heavy. But as the storm fades, the clouds begin to thin, drifting slowly across the open sky. Soon, large spaces of blue appear between them. The mind experiences something very similar. After learning not to feed every thought, not to chase every worry, not to resist every feeling, the inner sky begins to open. Moments of quiet appear between thoughts. At first, these moments are brief. Just a few seconds where the mind feels still. Then a thought returns. But if attention remains soft and gentle, the quiet spaces begin to grow. And with those spaces comes something many people have not felt for a long time: inner room to breathe. Have you ever noticed how peaceful it feels when the mind is no longer crowded? When there is simply space, silence, presence. This is not a silence created by force. It is the natural stillness that appears when the mind stops holding on to everything. In that stillness, the body also begins to respond. The muscles soften, the breathing becomes deeper, the heartbeat slows, and the mind no longer feels like a place of tension. Instead, it begins to feel like a wide, open space. There is a quiet moment many people recognize when this happens. They are lying in bed, eyes closed, noticing their breath. Thoughts are still present, but they are distant now, like soft echoes far away. And suddenly, they realize something surprising. They are no longer trying to sleep. They are simply resting. And in that gentle rest, sleep begins to arrive on its own, not forced, not chased, just like a quiet visitor who enters a room when everything becomes calm enough to welcome it. The body sinks deeper into the bed. The breath slows even more, and the mind drifts into sleep the same way a leaf drifts onto the surface of still water. Softly, naturally, without effort. Because when the mind finally stops running, it remembers how to rest. 12. Night as a place of inner stillness. But there is one final realization that many people slowly discover. Once the mind begins to quiet down, the night was never the enemy. For a long time, many people believe that nighttime itself is the problem. They think something about the darkness makes the mind restless. Something about the silence brings anxiety. Something about lying in bed awakens worries that refuse to leave. So night becomes something to fight against, a battle with thoughts, a struggle to force sleep, an endless attempt to escape the noise of the mind. But when we look more carefully at everything we have explored together, something very different begins to appear. The night did not create the noise. The night simply revealed it. During the day, the mind is surrounded by movement, conversations, responsibilities, distractions, endless activity. Those things often cover the quiet patterns happening inside the mind. But when night arrives, the world finally slows down. The lights dim. The streets grow quieter. The body begins to rest. And in that quiet space, the mind becomes visible to itself. At first, that silence can feel uncomfortable. Thoughts that were hidden during the day begin to surface. Worries seem louder. Memories appear more vividly. But something important begins to change once a person understands the nature of those thoughts. They are not enemies. They are not commands. They are simply movements passing through the mind. And once we stop feeding them with constant attention, their power begins to fade. This is when the night slowly transforms. Instead of feeling like a battlefield of overthinking, it becomes something much softer. A place where the mind can rest. A place where the body can heal. A place where the inner world has space to breathe again. There is a quiet image that captures this transformation beautifully. Imagine a lake in the mountains. During a windy day, the surface of the lake is restless. Waves ripple across the water, distorting every reflection. The sky above cannot be clearly seen in the water because the surface is constantly moving. But when the wind fades and the air becomes still, the lake begins to settle. Little by little, the surface becomes calm, and suddenly, the sky appears clearly in the water. The mind works in a very similar way. When thoughts constantly stir the surface of the mind, everything feels unclear and restless. But when the mind is no longer feeding every thought, when attention gently returns to the breath, when acceptance replaces resistance, something begins to settle inside. The inner surface becomes still, and in that stillness, a quiet kind of clarity appears. Many people begin to notice something surprising at this stage. The night no longer feels heavy. Instead, it begins to feel peaceful. The silence that once felt uncomfortable now feels soothing. The darkness no longer feels empty. It feels spacious. The body sinks into the bed more deeply. The breath becomes slower and softer, and the mind begins to experience something that is very rare during the busy hours of the day: true inner quiet. Have you ever experienced a moment when everything inside suddenly became calm? No urgent thoughts, no pressure to solve anything, just a gentle sense that everything is allowed to rest for a while. This kind of stillness is not something we force. It appears naturally when the mind stops struggling. In many Buddhist traditions, the night is actually considered a precious time for the mind, because when the world grows quiet, the mind has the opportunity to return to itself, to release the weight of the day, to let the body restore its energy, to allow the deeper layers of awareness to soften and open. Sleep, in this sense, becomes more than just physical rest. It becomes a form of quiet healing, a time when the nervous system relaxes, when the mind reorganizes itself, when emotional tension slowly dissolves. But this healing can only happen when the mind is not constantly feeding the flames of worry and regret. When thoughts are allowed to pass, when the breath becomes an anchor, when the day is gently set down, and when acceptance replaces resistance. In that kind of night, something beautiful happens. Sleep arrives naturally, not as something chaste or forced, but as a quiet visitor welcomed by a peaceful mind. And perhaps the most comforting truth of all is this: the stillness we search for at night was never far away. It was always there, waiting beneath the noise of our thoughts. Core message of the video. Perhaps after listening to everything we have explored together, a quiet realization begins to form. Maybe the night was never the thing stealing your sleep. For so long, many of us believed that something about the darkness itself made the mind restless. We blamed the silence. We blamed the late hours. We blamed the endless thoughts that seemed to appear the moment our head touched the pillow. But as we have gently seen throughout this journey, the night is not what keeps the mind awake. It is the thoughts we continue to feed. The mind, in many ways, is like a small fire. A fire cannot burn forever on its own. It needs fuel. It needs something to keep feeding the flame. Our thoughts work the same way. A thought appears, and that is completely natural. The mind was designed to produce thoughts, just as the sky produces clouds. But when we begin analyzing every thought, replaying it, worrying about it, building stories around it, we unknowingly place more wood onto the fire, and slowly the flame grows. Yet something beautiful happens the moment we see this clearly. We realize that peace does not come from eliminating every thought. It comes from no longer feeding them. Thoughts may still appear, just like clouds passing across the night sky. But when we stop chasing them, when we stop attaching ourselves to every story the mind creates, they begin to move on their own. And in the space they leave behind, stillness quietly returns. Perhaps tonight, when the world around you becomes quiet again, you might experience the night in a slightly different way. Instead of fighting the mind, you simply let the day end. You allow the body to soften into the bed, You notice the gentle rhythm of your breathing, and when a thought appears, you do not chase it. You simply allow it to pass. Little by little, the mind remembers something it has always known how to do: how to rest. Because the truth is, the mind does not need to be forced into silence. It only needs the freedom to stop feeding the noise, and when that happens, the night slowly transforms. It is no longer a place where we battle our thoughts. It becomes a quiet space where the mind can finally return to its natural state, calm, open, and at peace. If these reflections resonated with something inside you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share your experience in the comments and let us know how your mind feels when the night becomes quiet. And if you find peace in these kinds of reflections, you are warmly invited to continue this journey with us by following Buddhist Teachings Audio, where we explore gentle wisdom that helps calm the mind and bring more clarity into everyday life. Thank you truly for spending this time here. Wherever you are listening from tonight, may your mind grow lighter, your breath become softer, and may the quiet of the night bring you the rest your heart has been waiting for.